we'll start up, and I want to welcome everyone to this wonderful Lunch and Learn. We're going to have a deep dive into the history of Jews in the Americas with three new books, two focusing on the Caribbean, one on New York, which is anyone who knows a little bit about this understands that New York, in many ways, is a Caribbean city. It's a Caribbean city even today. If you walk the streets of many neighborhoods, you will hear as much Caribbean music and see as much, you see Caribbean food and see Caribbean people. And so as someone who is from the Caribbean, I feel very at home in New York, and I miss it very much. I miss walking the streets of that Manhattan Island. But this is part of the virtual version of our Global Nacao conference. And one of the animating ideas behind this conference was interconnections between disparate places that on the map they may seem disconnected, but actually have a tremendous amount of intimate contact and influence on each other. And it's hard to understand one without the other. And I think that's one of the things we're going to see in today's panel. I want to just, before we dive into the material, I want to thank the ASF for putting this together. I want to thank Drora Arusi for masterminding this and keeping the energy going, even in this virtual reality. I want to welcome all the attendees, making time out of your day. And people talk about how much time you have during this time, but it's weird because time does also slip away, and people, especially, there are many jobs that you're working a lot more, especially if there are little children around and other obligations. So it's always heartening and invigorating to see people coming and making time for these things. Just one other official note, this is also co-sponsored by the Rabbi Arthur Schneier program in International Affairs from Yeshiva University that I'm the director of, and it's part of our Diasporas program, which has, again, a vision of thinking about people and culture and societies as networks and beyond borders and creating bridges. And I think, again, we're going to see these themes come up. I'm gonna step into the background. The structure of today's talk will be each of the authors will have about 10 minutes or so to discuss their new book. And then I have a couple questions to for all of them to start a discussion, but we'll also be paying attention to the Q&A box down below. So please, to the attendees, please include your questions there. We'll be paying attention to that, and also the chat, and we'll definitely be funneling those questions into the conversation. And I really look forward to this not being the last of these sort of virtual meetings until we can get ourselves in person back in New York for an actual face-to-face conference.
I'm going to interrupt because it's not the last. We have 2 more sessions next week.
Dora, would you like to give a little, or you
I was going to say it at the end, but when you said this isn't the last.
No, I meant academic one. Sorry.
Yeah, no, next 2 weeks are 2 international sessions. One on Sunday, the Azharot service, because it cannot be done in synagogue. So it'll be done with cantors from around the world, really. It's incredible what they brought together. And that'll be at 10 o'clock Eastern time on Sunday, and then at 12 o'clock, again, a lunch and learn on Tuesday. However, that's going to be about 2 hours long because we actually have 9 communities, about half from North America and half from Europe. So it's really this whole group coming together, either leaders of the community or scholars and rabbis and cantors coming together to talk about it. So we're not leaving this to go, and we already talked about other things in the future. We encourage you to encourage us. So
thank you.
Now back to you.
All right, so we're going to start with Professor Hilit Surowitz-Israel from the Department of Religion at Rutgers University. She's going to discuss her new book, American Diasporas: The Creolization of Religion in the Colonial Atlantic World. very excited to hear about this book, and I'll turn it over to Hilit.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dora and Ronnie, for organizing this. I really appreciate the effort to bring everybody together. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book, which is in its hopefully final stages now. I'm very excited about it after a very long time. So what American diasporas, the creolization of religion in the colonial Atlantic world, what my book is doing, or what it does, is it places religion at the center of our discussion of the formation of the Jewish communities and the Jewish communal identities of Nacao in the Americas. And by focusing on Curacao as the nexus, or focusing specifically on Curacao's Mikveh Israel congregation, specifically in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, what I'm looking to do is show the way that Mikveh Israel became a mother congregation in the Americas, not only by a means of establishing dominance with highly centralized and authoritarian religious governing body, but also through this kind of long and patient process of gifting, exchange of material culture, establishing these gifts, established relationships that often came with significant strings attached, as many gifts do, requiring devotion, recognition of patronage, the establishment of religious minhag, of norms, and kind of thereby establishing the congregation's centrality to American Jewish life. And whereas there has been obviously over decades a focus on the economic networks of Nacao throughout the Atlantic world, what I've seen is that religion is oftentimes, or religiosity is oftentimes, either treated as secondary, right? It's a mention. Oh, look at these tombstones that we found. They have these religious motifs. Or it's just assumed, right? The category that these are Sephardic agents or Portuguese Jewish agents is often just assumed, and the category of religion and centrality to the formation of these communities and the identities of these communities isn't really interrogated. Very, very kind of theoretically. And I would say that my book in many ways is theoretical. It looks at theories of diaspora, it looks at theories of gifting, and it also looks at kind of how we can look at these categories of diaspora and gifting to better understand or interrogate the category of religion. And what does that mean? Now, one of the reasons I think that this category, I think there are a few reasons why religiosity has either been treated as something which, simply exists. These were Jews, or these were conversos. Of course, they formed synagogues. Oh, wow, there's a mikvah, kind of this type of approach to much of what we've seen in the New World, in the Americas, and not only with Jewish communities. I think that this is something that has happened with many religious communities throughout the Americas, is that there is a surprise at kind of the religious production, at the centrality of religion, at kind of the religious creativity and dynamism which takes place kind of over the period of the kind of colonial Atlantic. So I think this is for a few reasons. First of all, there is this bias which exists that the New World is this center of kind of economic exploitation, right? It's a center of the kind of the genocide of existing peoples for reaping the benefit, right, of economic benefits of Europeans. It's the site of encounter. It's the site of kind of, it's a new world, right? But kind of this idea of new religion is often not kind of put into dialogue with kind of, let's say, the Euro-American communities which arrive, right? So that would be Jews, Christians, etc., right? And this kind of idea of religious creolization or the dynamism of religion is often only spoken about when it comes to kind of the kind of Afro-Creole religions, right, which emerge, or let's say the the creolization of various indigenous traditions, which occurs kind of over the series of centuries. The other is I think the other reason that this often happens is because of basically the tremendous and tremendously interesting economic networks which are forged throughout the Atlantic world, and kind of that make the Atlantic a much smaller space than it actually is. The familial relationships, the economic relationships are groundbreaking. They're absolutely amazing, right? And sometimes I think in some of the earlier scholarship, it was difficult to kind of interrogate why these networks were able to exist in a particular way and see what it is that's behind them. The other is that in general, and what happens with kind of this approach is that the Jewishness, right? And I don't have a better term right now, at least in this type of discussion, right? The Jewishness of these congregations or these individuals was often marginalized. Not only was it seen as secondary to their economic dealings or their familiar interactions, but kind of the bias that is often inherent in many of the kind of converso, studies or, from both, within and outside of the field. Also kind of the seriousness in terms of religious production in the Americas. I think that all of these things greatly influenced the way that we discuss Nacao. But the religiosity, and again, and I would say another aspect of this is that the religiosity of the Caribbean in general, right? And the narrow definition with which religion is interrogated, especially in non-European spaces, it challenges the opportunity to really discuss, religion as a central feature, as a central unifying feature, as a significant feature in the identity and the formation of these communities. And then there's kind of this other thing that happens, right, which is, in some ways, I've been thinking about this recently as I'm finishing up, that this kind of idea of this kind of rogue Jewish pirate fills a different type of imagination. It fulfills kind of a different type of kind of muscular Judaism, which predates, let's say, Zionism. And I think there's something very exciting in Jewish studies about finding these kind of pirate figures, right? Whether or not they actually exist. And I think that both of these things take away, right, from our ability to look at the Jewish, the Portuguese Jewish community in Curacao, in the Caribbean, as these active religious agents, which are in some ways mirroring, right, their experience of religious production and religious community that happened in Europe, for my community specifically Amsterdam and obviously later London. But also to see kind of the intentionality with which this was done, and kind of the most exciting thing is that this is the foundation of American Judaism. It's not in the 19th century. It's not in North America. It's not with large scale, Eastern European or Central European immigration of, Ashkenazi individuals, but rather, right, it's with Sephardic Jews, 17th century, even 16th century, and we're laying the foundations for a kind of specifically American Jewish identity or community. And listen, as everyone here knows, the documents are far flung, they're difficult to access, their condition is absolutely horrible. They're in multiple languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Hebrew, French, all together in a mishmash, and they're difficult to access. And so it's no surprise that it's only in recent decades that we've been able to really do this. And this book, right, American Diasporas, as I said, it places religion at the center and then uses it as a launching point to see the relationships and the influence that Curaçao's had on other American communities, and maps this process through initially the relationship between Curaçao and its mother congregation of Amsterdam, and that looks at the instances over the 17th and 18th centuries where Curaçao is not only the site of religious creativity and production, right, the process of creolization that takes place, but through then Curaçao's relationship with burgeoning American communities or fledgling American Portuguese Jewish communities. And I look at several examples where we can see Curaçao's Mikveh Israel kind of replacing Amsterdam as a site of religious knowledge, religious production, and also kind of religious financial support. And this is done, and what I do is, in the book, basically, this is done through broadening the category with which we interrogate religion, right? Understanding materiality and embodiment alongside the more typical category of belief, but also through a closer reading of diaspora identity and the performance of diaspora identity. And finally, through the process of religious production, which happens in response to the new American reality. So I'll give a brief example of each of these, and I know time is limited, and I just realized that I didn't show any of the slides that I had prepared, so I will enjoy those at my leisure, I guess. The first, which I think is probably the most commonly recognized, is right that Curaçao's Mikveh Israel congregation, and the first slide would have showed you that Curaçao is a small island 35 miles north of Venezuela, small island, small arid island in the Caribbean, that Curaçao's Mikveh Israel often transferred funds to newer American Jewish community or ailing American Jewish communities and Jewish communities beyond the Americas. Hebron, you know, in the land of Israel for them, in other European Jewish communities, let's say. But if we're looking in the Americas for what we now know as the Turo Synagogue for Surowitz Israel, they're asking Curaçao for money to build, to create communities, and Curaçao says yes. Now, I think a lot of the previous scholarship says yes, of course they said yes, right? They were asked for money. These are their family, but we all know family relationships aren't always that simple, right? Right? This is their family. Of course they gave them the money. And what I'm saying is it's not of course. First of all, with that money, right, and more theoretical discussion of what a gift is, but with that money, they are demanding that certain rights or minhag remain the same, that they always remain Sephardic despite the growing Ashkenazi presence in these synagogues or congregations. They are demanding that Mikveh Israel of Curaçao be recognized annually or on certain holidays or in certain rituals every single year, right? And so what does that type of patronage mean, right? That's not just a gift, right? That's an establishment of a certain type of presence. It's a performance of dominance. It's a performance of being a mother congregation. It's the same performative aspects that Amsterdam had undertaken in their relationship in the Americas. The second way I look at it, not only through the gifting of kind of money and ritual objects, but I look at it through the performance of diaspora identity. One way that I do this, which I always think is very fun, is going through thousands of ship names, right? And in this crowd, I can say that looking over logs of ship names is fun, right? And what I have seen, what emerges is this pattern that Christian ship owners did not tend to name their ships with biblical names. They tended to name them after people that they knew. They tended to name them after elements of nature. They tended to name them after fortune or success or all of these things which they hoped to have. But that many Jewish ship owners named their ships with biblical names. The King David, you know, the Rebecca, our mother. And this is a certain type of performative element, especially right in a space where the performance of Judaism is not always permissible. And by looking at these kind of performative aspects of diaspora, I think that it can tell us more about kind of the Jewishness, or right, without looking at belief. What do people really believe, right? Religion, that's a really difficult question, right? But there are other ways to understand the way that people perform and embody their religious identities, right? Or perform and embody their kind of multiple diasporic horizons for Zion, for Iberia, for Amsterdam. And this is one way. And the third area that I look at, and I know that I have about a minute left, the third area that I look at is in terms of religious production, which I have to say has wholesale really been not looked at in terms of kind of early Jewish communities. And I'm going to bring up two examples just because I have just a few minutes and I can't wait to hear about Laura and Stan's work. The first is in 1773. Now we know that in 1712 there was a shela that was sent to, it was probably from Brazil. It was sent to Izmir and it said, what do we do in the Southern Hemisphere if we need a prayer for rain? We live on kind of the wrong side of the equator, you know? And right, that was asked not in Curacao, it was asked earlier. And that was sent back to kind of the old world for response. Well, this is what you should do. But in 1773 in Curacao, Chacham de Sola makes a totally different decision. He's aware that these questions are being asked, but he writes an entirely new 56-page prayer book on the prayer for rain. What do you do on an arid island? And in many ways, right, the prayer for rain looks just like any other kind of prayer for rain ceremony that you would see everywhere else. But he didn't ask permission from Amsterdam to do this. He printed it there. He didn't seek advice on how it should be done. He simply said, I'm doing this. And this is what my congregation will use, right? And through not only his travels, but the travels of other leadership that comes through Mikveh Israel, right? This sets a standard of, the Americas is going to religiously produce. It doesn't need to seek permission. It can slowly replace that kind of centralized mother congregation. And lastly, one of the most exciting examples, I think, is in 1760. Abraham Mendes de Castro commissions the first Hebrew book by and for an American from the island of Curacao. The first Hebrew book that's commissioned by and for an American is in Curacao. And it is a 2-column Bible, which I did have a picture of in my slides, but is a 2-column Bible where Hebrew and Spanish text would appear side by side. And it's beautiful. Calfskin binding, multiple colored fonts. It's beautiful. And then even though there had been Yiddish Bibles that had been printed like this since the 16th century in Europe, and Spanish and Ladino Bibles had obviously been printed, this 2-column Bible, which is responding to the specific needs of an American community with re-Judaizing conversos coming directly from Iberia or kind of the Spanish Atlantic, he is responding to the needs of the colonial community. And he's not asking for permission to print it. He's not asking for permission to create it. He is commissioning an exceptionally expensive book, which is going to be the standard bearer on the island. With all proceeds, this is the best part, all proceeds of this Bible were not to go to Mikveh Israel. They were to go to the Jews in Hebron. Right, and I think this kind of reflects not only Curacao assuming this position of this kind of patron community of this mother congregation the way Amsterdam had done, but it also shows kind of the process of creolization, the kind of recognition of a new sociocultural reality. It shows the significance with which people performed and embodied their diaspora identity. And it shows the significance and centrality for understanding and interrogating religion as an independent variable, right? As something which is central to the formation of these communities, to their identity, and to the way that religion or kind of the Portuguese Jewish religiosity is going to act throughout the Atlantic space. So thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Hilit. Wow, that's such a, one of the hardest things to do is to summarize in lucid form something that's taken years and years and years to put together. So, but that's, you really, I think, whet our appetite to know more and to go deeper. And now, without further ado, I want to turn to another Caribbean island, not far from Curacao, the island of Jamaica, with Professor Stanley Mirvis, Assistant Professor of History and the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University, with The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, a testamentary history of a diaspora in transition. And turn to Stanley.
Thank you, Ronnie, and thank you, Drora, for putting this together. And can I also ask you to cut me off when I go too long, without any mercy. So I'm very grateful to be here and have an opportunity to talk about this new book. I think in a lot of ways, my book really dovetails really well with what Hilit is talking about here. And I'm really inspired by her remarks because it seems like there's a real consolidated discussion moving this field forward in a new way with Laura's research and Hilit's research. And I'll also mention that this month, Aviva Ben-Or has a book coming out on Suriname. So I think for the first time, we're in this position where we're starting to talk about the Caribbean as a field unto itself, and not just a kind of footnote to the early American Jewish experience, or as just these satellites and peripheries of Amsterdam. And so I think this is a really exciting time to be alive for Portuguese scholars and researchers into the Western Sephardic diaspora, where we're starting to ask new questions and think of these spaces as inhabiting really their own identities. So it's really a great discussion. And so what I will do with my time is I'd like to sort of deconstruct my title a little bit of the book, which is The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, A Testamentary History of a Diaspora in Transition. And I want to kind of treat each of those different elements on their own and what brought me to want to talk about those specific things. And I think you'll see that really I'm in agreement with Hilit and every aspect of what she presented. So, and first of all, why the 18th century? Let's leave Jamaica to the end. And almost more interesting to me is why the 18th century. And that's really what brought me to this project. Is when I was studying, working on my PhD, it became very clear to me as I was reading into the scholarship on the Western Sephardi diaspora that there was a real focus on the period of regionalization, as I would call it, like this period between 1580 and about 1700, when there is this real a real effort to trickle out of Iberian Peninsula after the annexation of Portugal to Spain and into Protestant Western Europe, and then to satellite communities of London and Hamburg and Livorno and India and the Americas and so on. So this is really a global story. And really the Dutch Golden Age, the 17th century, the age of Spinoza, right? This is Rio de Costa and Charles Livy Mortiera. This is what has generated the most focus in the scholarship. And so it seemed to me that the 18th century was kind of this void, this blank space. What was happening in the 18th century? Not only was it a blank canvas, but in some ways it was dismissed as being relevant to the story at all. In one case, it's called this a story of slow eclipse by a very prominent historian, and this is because there were a series of economic crises in Amsterdam. And most of the communities of the Western Sephardic diaspora, they're over the course of the 18th century, there were Ashkenazi majorities, as Hilit mentioned. So it seemed as if long-standing notions of, I would say, ethnic supremacy among the Portuguese, of this kind of internalized purity of blood that they brought with them from their converso experience into Amsterdam and into London and Hamburg, this began to ebb away as they started to intermarry more with Ashkenazim, as they became even more integrated with Sephardim from the Ottoman world. So this was always seen as a period of eclipse, and in the place where there was focus on Portuguese communities in the 18th century had been the Caribbean. But in that case, always as sort of this, chapter one of the colonial American Jewish experience. Like literally, that's Jacob Rader Marcus's, epic 3-volume magnum opus, I would say, The Colonial American Jew. Well, the first couple chapters are Martinique, Jamaica, Barbados, Suriname, and then there's 2 volumes about about New York, and Charleston and Newport. So I felt like there was another story happening here at the 18th century. And as I looked into it, I came to pretty much the same conclusion that Hilit just laid out so articulately, and that is it's only a eclipsed story if you're just looking at Amsterdam. So yeah, that seems to be the case in Amsterdam. But if you were to flip the peripheries and the centers of this diaspora, then you see that there's still a really vibrant cultural, social, economic Portuguese diaspora that's continuing into the 18th century. So one of the goals of my book then was to hold up what were satellite communities, peripheries, as being the center communities and decentralizing Amsterdam in the story. And what you find, I think, is very similar to what Hilit was mentioning, these kind of localized centers of autonomy, especially Curacao, that has this regional autonomy of its own. It becomes its own mother community. And even Jamaica also becomes has its own regional autonomy, where it's also a patron to smaller communities, especially in the English-speaking Americas, where it's the largest community of Jews outside of London in the English-speaking world. So, and it's really the only place in the English Americas where there is a sustained rabbinic leadership. Barbados does have rabbinic leadership. It's not like in Jamaica where you have one Chacham who serves for 40 years, an Eitz Chaim trained rabbi who, very similar to what Hilit was talking about, is really able to transition the community to kind of a religious autonomy. So I don't have any smoking guns for this kind of religious autonomy, but one indication, and I mentioned this in the book, is that when you look at the Capodores de Cartas of London, that is the communal letters that are intercommunal letters that are sent between smaller communities in London, in the years, only I think it was 5 years before the Chacham Joshua Zakai de Cordova shows up in Jamaica from Curacao, having first served in Curacao. Errant scofflaw of the community. We don't know exactly what he did. That's the problem with communal records, is that with the communal letters, those specific documents, is that they're not very specific about what people are being censored for. But a member of the community had been sent to London to be tried by the Beit Din there, that is the rabbinic judiciary body. And he had been, and so there were two cases actually that I found in those records. They all predate the arrival of Joshua Zakai de Cordova. Once he gets there, those seem to stop, which may suggest that now they're dealing with these things internally. So there is this new center of rabbinic authority that someone like de Cordova brings to the table. So there is. So back to the why the 18th century. My goal again was to try to flip the script a little bit about what is the center of the Western Sephardic diaspora, and it was very conspicuous in Jamaica, especially when you look at the diasporic connections that are within wills, because you find that in the second half of the sample of my wills, and I'll talk about wills in a second, the connections to Amsterdam basically disappear. And now you may say that's not surprising. It was part of the English Empire and British Empire and all that. But when you're thinking about Jews as a diasporic entity and not an imperial entity, something that transcended imperial borders, then it really is quite surprising that these connections really disappear from Amsterdam, but they continue to grow and develop with what had been a periphery, with London, which really was this kind of a really inconsequential in some ways satellite of Amsterdam. And then more interestingly is that the connections to smaller communities, be it Suriname or be it especially Bayonne, which is something I talk a lot about, Bayonne, a city in southwestern France, those connections stay consistent throughout the 18th century. And not only that, but Bayonne and Jamaica are so deeply connected. And this is something, a point that I really make a lot in the book, that I found surprising just how deeply interconnected these two communities were, so much that I believe Bayonne to really be the true seed community of Jamaica. So it seems to suggest that the kind of connections between these smaller communities were much more sustained and consistent than was a kind of metropolitan patronage onto colony. So that's partially what I mean by a diaspora in transition, which is part of my title, is that it's in transition in a lot of ways. And one of those ways is that the metropole is kind of receding and connections between smaller communities are growing much more significant. And that's one thing that one point that I try to make. Okay, and so let me now move on to another part of my title, testamentary history. I have 2 minutes left. Oh, really? I can't hear. Only 3 minutes left. I can't hear you. Okay, I'm gonna do this very quickly. Oh boy, that went by so fast. I'll just mention why testamentary history. Why did I focus on wills? So this book is even less than Jamaica. My book is meant to be a case study in a single type of source, and that was really part of my goal. And that was because wills were the only real sources that were available to me in Jamaica. That is because the communal records of Jamaica were destroyed in a major fire in 1883 in Kingston when the synagogues were engulfed in flames. So all the records inside were also destroyed. Anything that survived was then destroyed in 1907 with a follow-up disaster, an earthquake in 1907, which I'm writing about now. So there were no communal records. There was no Pinkaskila. There was no internal copies of letters. There were no Shelotu Chuvot. There was no sermons, anything, nothing. All that I really had were these notarial records. So that's what led me to want to study wills. And wills, they had only really been used. There had been some interest in them, of course, but only been used sort of anecdotally or genealogically to talk about a specific individual. My goal was to, let's see what happens kind of thing. Let's pull them all together, get all the wills of a community. Jamaica made it possible to do that because it's so small. You know, it's a periphery within a periphery in some ways. So I was able to collect all what I believe to be all the wills of a community. And let's see what breaking those down reveals. And I found that it reveals a lot of things about public piety, kind of things that Hilit was talking about. The process of rejudaization into the 18th century that's happening on a familial level, familial incentives to bring conversos out of South America or out of Iberia or even out of Spanish Trinidad and bring them into the fold of the Jewish community by offering financial incentives, the role of the Jewish community within the individual. So I'll stop here by saying that my book deals with three different kind of confluences. And that is one, the confluence of the individual with the family, right? And what is that, how is that expressed through wills? Two is then the confluence of a family with a community. What's the role of the community within that life? And then I would say number three is the confluence of a community within a whole diaspora. And when you take all those ingredients together, you get my book. And if I have a moment, I'm going to do a very shameless plug, and I'm going to feed my capitalist tendencies, the worst of them. And I want to, you're welcome to email me and I'll send you a flyer, but if there's a promo code, the book just came out this week. And if anyone is interested in a 25% discount, that's available by using the promo code YEJEC.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. Put it in the chat.
Oh yeah,
so
I will
people
do
can see
that.
it.
That's okay.
Much better.
Echo Juliet, Echo Charlie, and I'm going to put it in the chat. Okay, so thank you very much, and I sorry if I went over my time.
I want to thank Professor Mirvis not only for a fantastic intro, but also saving us from the curse of buying retail. You know,
Yeah.
that's a deeply, deeply troubling option. So thank you. Thank you for that. And shameless plugs are welcome.
It's part of the game.
With taste. And now we move on to, as I mentioned before, another island, the island of Manhattan, of New York in general, with Professor Laura Leibman. Professor Leibman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College. This is, I think, her third book. Is that correct? Depends how you count them, right? Maybe fourth. And the book is The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects. And without any further ado, let's go to The Art of the Jewish Family.
Okay, it's saying that I can't share my screen right now for some reason. So, oh, now it's letting me. Thank you. So
I want to just remind also I'm going to remind the participants and the people listening in, please send questions to the Q&A box. And if that's giving you trouble, just put it in the chat and we will access them. We're probably going to go past 1 o'clock. So stick around. You're welcome to stick around. I wish we could offer you some coffee or tea, but we can't. But okay.
Yeah, and Ronnie, again, I'm going to try to keep it short, but feel free to give me some warnings of time if I'm running.
I'll make, okay.
I've got you up at the top. So, Laura Leibman, thank you so much to everybody for coming, and I'm going to go through quickly enough that we can have some time for Q&A. It's not letting me click forward, so I'm going to use my, oh, there we go. Okay, let me go back. So basically, like Stan, my work starts with a problem in some sense. So Stan was starting with like, how do I write a history of a community that has no records? And he turned to wills. I would say for me, the question was similar of like, what do I do about a time period where women tend to be left out of the discussion? So, and I think this is a particular problem for women's history, for Sephardic women's history, because if you look at the women's histories by and large, they tend to spend about 15% of the time before 1820. Now, obviously that pains those of us who are colonial scholars, but I would say it also has a weird, what we would call Ashkenormativity impact on American Jewish history for women's history, because suddenly American Jewish history only counts when Sephardim stop being the center of American Jewish history. So there's something weird there. And I want to explain why is it that these scholars who are fantastic scholars have been spending so little time on that early period. And that's really an issue that's been raised by several different people, including Barry Stifel and Jacob Rader-Marcus, which is there are very few documents by women from this time period. So back to sort of Stan's question, what do I do when I don't have that wealth of documents? So Jacob Rader-Marcus wrote this book with over 1,000 pages of documents for American Jewish women. Less than 60 of those pages are before 1800, and not even all of those are by women. So you start to get a sense, this is a scholar who devoted his life to the colonies, and he can't find anything. So what do you do in order to bring back that sense of what was going on with women, but particularly Sephardic women during this time period when Sephardim are the mainstays of congregations and setting the tone for American Jewish life? So my response to this has been different. Many scholars have just been like, I throw up my hands in despair. Let's move on to time periods where there are documents. So I'm suggesting, no, let's not do that. Another response typically has been, let's look at the few Jewish women who happened to write a lot of documents. So women like Rebecca Gratz or Abigail Franks, notably both Ashkenazi, and very atypical for this time period. So they wrote beautiful things, but these are super wealthy women when the vast majority of women in communities in the Americas at this point are very poor. So very hard to write a history of what women in general are doing based on these two women's histories. So I suggest instead two different ways of going about putting together a Jewish women's history from this time period. The first method is to look at objects. So I'm really interested, as somebody who works in material culture, on the things that women owned and had in their possession, and occasionally things that women themselves made. So an example of a sort of women's object would be this teacup, which some of you may recognize the scene on it. It is of Yodin Savannah, which is Jew Savannah, and tea rituals were dominated by women. They were led by women, and they're very much a women-centered thing. So I'm interested in objects that women had and how that could tell their stories. The second part of what I'm interested in is sort of what happens when you turn to the back of that teacup, which is you'll notice, it's not really a perfect teacup, it's missing something. And it's this fragment, in some sense, a beautiful fragment of a teacup, but a fragment. And I'm really interested in why were women's voices left out of the archives? Why did they not get preserved? And trying to make that question of fragments central to what I'm talking about. So just to give you a different idea of what I mean by fragments, I'm kind of thinking I might skip this part. Should I skip ahead, Ronnie? What do you think? You're saying you don't know. Okay, I'm gonna skip a little, I'll go really fast there. So fragments, basically I'm interested in, about 3 years ago, I was at the Barbados Synagogue complex. I had been doing a lot of archival work. I was really interested in the women in the complex, having a hard time finding out anything about them. And as I was going around the complex, they were doing a bunch of renovation work. And all over the ground were these little shards of Delftware. And I was fascinated by them because I knew that one of the women I was writing about had begun her life enslaved in Barbados. And this is one of the women who's in the volume. And there had been these 4 houses in the complex, and I was so interested in, like, would the enslaved people have actually touched these little shards, and what could I make of the sense that these little fragments were left? So I asked people to sort of think about, what would this fragment have been, right? We don't know. Would it have been a plate? Would it have been a bowl? Something that was deemed not worth preserving, that was just sort of ended up in a rubbish heap, most likely from one of the hurricanes that swept through the island and destroyed those houses. So instead of having all that wealth of, like, how it would have been on a table with all the silver, we're just left with this little shard. So in the book, I really try and look at those fragments that we have left from the documentary record and think about what ruptured them, what caused people to break into fragments. So the first chapter focuses on a letter from a Sephardic woman asking for assistance from Surowitz-Israel. And it's very much like a random moment in this woman's life, like one of those little shards. And I try to think about how different structural forces broke her life apart and caused her to need to get assistance. And those would be the lack of education in English that she happened to have, and the way that women were educated during this time period, the laws that were going on in the colonies. She could not inherit from her husband because he died intestate, and everything went to her son. Issues around mental illness. Her son inherited everything. He was deemed insane, and all the money goes to the town to take care of him instead of being there for her. And then finally, just the way that charity works, that we happen to have her letter in part because she writes at the end a little note to somebody on the Ma'amad. But normally these letters were thrown away, that they weren't deemed worth saving. They would just record sending you some money. So she's a much more typical woman. About 50% of the women fall in this poor category who would probably need assistance at some point. But able to sort of pull apart, what do these fragments mean? I'll go through more quickly through the other chapters. So that's the first chapter, is looking at her record. The second one is looking at silver and the way that silver was used in terms of marriage ceremonies. I look at 6 silver beakers, which were made for Reina Levi Moses by her uncle, who was a silversmith. Skip a little farther. The third chapter is on a little ivory miniature that was made by that woman who began her life enslaved in Barbados. And like all of the women in this book, she doesn't stay put. This is sort of to Ronnie's point. All of these women live some of their time in New York. This woman lives in Barbados, in Suriname, in London, they're all moving around the Atlantic before they land in New York. So I'm really looking at the role her miniature plays in her life. The fourth object signals this shift from these kind of arranged marriages of what we call yoke mates to soulmates, somebody who is able now finally to marry for love. And I'm really interested in the role of emotions in terms of family bonds. And the commonplace books are a little bit like Facebook for the 19th century. It's a collection of little fragments. And so I look at one woman's collection of fragments and think about how it tells us about the networks and people she had in her life. And finally, the fifth chapter is a woman who also began her life very poor as an orphan in London and ends up the Rebbitzin of one of the main congregations in New York. And I'm really interested in this family portrait silhouette and comparing it to other silhouettes of Jews during this era, and the role that the way that the people, both the position of the people in the silhouette is very different from most of them, and the way that they're using headgear. So finally we start to see everybody in the families wearing hats. The woman has her head covered. She looks like she's about 80 here. She's actually only 21 in this portrait. It's because of the kind of hat she's wearing and the sort of emphasis on covering the head. That's a very Ashkenazi thing during this time period, as opposed to normative for New York, and is very much a response against the reform movement and their attack on how Jews cover their head. So that's it. Those are my 5 objects. Again, I'm sort of looking at how women's roles in the community change and how the objects that they owned could help tell that story. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and allow people to ask questions. Oh, you're muted.
That was an impressive express tour of a lot of material. Do we have I'm going to start with a question. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box, but I'm sure they'll come. I have some bigger questions. How do you guys see, and all of you I think touched on this, some of the bigger historiographical issues, but how do you see your works connecting with larger trends? And connected to that, what's Jewish about these histories and what's American about them? What's right? And does it matter? Is that even a useful question? It's a question that's often asked. I remember when I first, many years back, a very esteemed professor of Jewish history met me, and he said, "Oh, what do you work on?" And I told him what I work on. He says, "What's Jewish about that?" And it caught me off guard because I thought it was obvious what was Jewish about it. But I look back now and I question, to what extent are these distinctions important? And it's clear that what you guys are doing is working on multiple levels. So I'm going to let you guys engage with that question. So like bigger trends, and to what extent is this? Do you see this as a about Jewish history, or is it about American history, or collapsing of those? You can take it from any way you want. Who'd like to start? Anyone jumping at it? Okay, Hilit, why don't you start? You started us off, so why don't we go back to you? Yeah.
So at least in terms of my work, first of all, looking at the Americas holistically, right? Not kind of the United States of America as America, right? Mm-hmm. Imagining the Americas holistically, picking up on some of what Stan was sharing, kind of this center periphery dynamic, looking at, perhaps the idea that the southern part of the Americas kind of was the center, after contact of, certain types of, religious production and the like, looking at the Americas kind of, and the tentacles kind of across the Atlantic world, et cetera. So that's one way that I would say. And then it also kind of looking in terms of situating it within the broader field, not only in terms of the Atlantic world, but I think in 2 other ways, which is looking at material culture and kind of embodiment as ways to look at the category, right, of religion, which is, an undefinable category in many ways. And lastly, and I want to hear everything that Laura and Stan also have to say. So, I would say lastly, kind of, I don't know how to, kind of taking, I think at least in the field of religion, I think they're not only in terms of the Atlantic world, but looking at material and embodiment, but also looking at processes of creolization, of diaspora as kind of important and kind of very dynamic junctures within kind of the dynamic, space that religion inhabits. Not necessarily, obviously, textual history. I mean, there's been a focus on lived religion for many, many years. And, David Morgan has focused on material culture within religion for many, many years, but kind of bringing these things together and looking at, religious traditions, which are understood as textual, perhaps, and kind of going beyond, as Laura kind of pointed us to, and saying kind of what other ways can we learn about these individuals. And I think that in that way, and then finally, when you say, the Jewishness or the Americanness, I think that that in some ways Jewish studies has often been marginalized as this area of study. And I think that the same way we study the Moravians of the Atlantic world, within American religious history, right, the religious history of the Americas holistically, I think that kind of demarginalizing Jews in the Atlantic world the same way somebody like Paul Gilroy did with African American or with Africans in the Atlantic world, right? Bringing Jews into that kind of main narrative, not marginalized, but kind of the main narrative of kind of the processes of religion and religious identity which are taking place, also kind of squarely puts my work within the direction that the field is pushing.
Can you, before we move on to Laura and Stan, can you define creolization? You used it very eloquently, but I think it'd be useful for people who aren't super familiar with it.
No, you're 100% right. One of my slides, which are all going to be left to your imagination, would have done that. The word creolization, and obviously Stan and Laura can also speak to this, is used in different ways at different times. Totally unhelpful thing to say. Right, but the process of creolization that I'm looking at actually fits in with kind of two ways the word is used. First of all, of looking of those things which are born and of the Americas, right? Kind of the initial, use of creolization in this realm, or kind of even within kind of study, but then also kind of this process of, jargony word, of hybridity, but kind of the interaction of different things to create something which is new, right? Which is kind of reflects kind of this kind of space of encounter. So I use the word, Creole, or kind of the creolization of religion, in both of those ways. The meeting of the intersection of the Atlantic world, and also that which is kind of born and of the Americas.
Thank you. Laura, Stan, wanna jump into that?
I'll unmute myself. I'll go next since I was
okay.
in order of
yeah, that makes things easy.
So in terms of larger trends, I don't know if I've made any great contribution to the field of Atlantic history, Atlantic studies, but I hope that Atlanticists will use my book and find my book useful. Will see it as a case study that they may be able to plug into a larger theoretical model. Because I'm very articulately against being theoretical, and I try to be a social historian, stay true to these kind of communal documents. So my first goal was to stay faithful to the texts that I had and try to depict them in the world that they existed. But I hope that my study will be able to be plugged in to the Atlantic world, and that is because there's multiple levels of entanglement here. There is on one hand, the Jews are transcendent of imperial borders and stated borders because of their diaspora, right? Where their metropole is Amsterdam, no matter where you are. If you're in New York, or if you're in Suriname, or if you're in Jamaica, or if you're in Brazil or India, right? You're looking to Amsterdam. But at the same time, they're part of the British Empire. So they're also looking to another metropole for political patronage, and that's London, the Board of Trade, the Jewish community of London. So there are these competing spheres of influence, but at the same time, they're indigenized and creolized and increasingly localized. So, and this defies an Atlantic studies model in some ways, where the concerns of Jews in Jamaica are very different than those of the metropole in London, right? The Jews in Jamaica, like in Barbados, they pay a surtax. This is just an example. Between 1692 and 1740, a Jewish surtax looks like the jizya of the Ottoman world, and that doesn't exist in Protestant Western Europe. So so the lobbying efforts, although it includes Western European players, is intended to deal with a situation that's specific to the Caribbean. So already there are different political concerns. The Jews of Jamaica exist within a slave society. So Jews in Western Europe own African slaves, but they don't live in slave societies where the majority of the population are enslaved. And so they're very different social concerns of the Jews in Jamaica as in London. So in some ways, I say in my preface that my book is about contradictions, about being both transcendent and Atlantic, but also being localized and indigenized, and that these kind of contradictions can coexist. And that's what makes the Atlantic a useful category of analysis. Now, what makes my study Jewish, and I'll just say this quickly, is that the population I study are all openly identifying Jews, and that's saying a lot when you're talking about Nacao, right? Because a whole other part of this diaspora are not openly identifying Jews. Some of them are crypto-Jewish, and probably most of them are sincerely Catholic conversos living in South America, living in Iberia, living in modern-day Belgium, southern part of the lowlands. So this is so when we're talking about, and of course, Nacao, I think also includes Portuguese Old Christians, and they have to be included in this. So there's a lot of layers of identity here. And if I've done anything, a contribution to how we identify as being Jewish in the Portuguese diaspora is that, unlike if you just read rabbinic sources, so if all you ever read were the sermons of Shaul Levi Mortiera, or if you only read Isaac de Castro, then maybe you would come away with the conclusion that once you've re-Judaized, you've sanitized your whole Catholic experience, you know? And I think when you look deeper into the open Jewish identity of the Portuguese world, you find that those centuries of Catholic identity aren't so easily jettisoned, and that there are remnants of that. And I think Hilit's in a better place to kind of tease out what that means, that kind of hybridity of converso Catholicism, whatever converso religion is, but how it continues to exist within an openly identifying Jewish community. You know, I think that's a big question that we need to tackle that's still left unsaid. I think now we're starting to, people like James Nelson Novoa are looking at trying to understand what are new Christians who are sincerely Catholic. Let's look at them. Nobody bothered to look at them before.
Yeah.
So we're starting to shift our focus there. And I think another place where there's a lacuna is, what is the Catholicism of open Jewish identity? So I think that's what a contribution might be to Jewish studies. And on to you, Laura.
Yeah.
So I would say, for me, the question that you're asking about what's Jewish about this is central to like what I'm trying to get at here. Compared to like my earlier work where I was looking, you know, as a material culture person at like gravestones with Hebrew writing and biblical scenes and mikvaot and synagogues, like these objects seem like not very Jewish, right? Because like any early American could have a letter or a cup or a portrait or a silhouette. In fact, many non-Jews did. But part of what I'm trying to get at is the way that Jews are using these objects. And I think that's for many of us who are practicing today, like there's something instinctive about this idea, right? Like my cup, many Americans own this cup, but does blue mean for them that it's part of their dairy wear? Do you know what I'm saying? So, or similarly, like, sure, many Americans wore hats during that time period, but I still remember very distinctly this moment with one of my students where I had mainly been wearing a fall with hats. And so my students decided the hat was my Jewishness. And she saw me at spring break with just a shadel on, and she said to me, "Oh no, Laura, where's your hat? Are you still Jewish?" And very earnestly, right? And I was sort of like, "Oh, my Jewishness is not in my hat, though it sort of is in my hat," right? So again, I think, or my equivalent of like commonplace books are like Facebook. Many of us do our Jewishness on Facebook, right? We can see that all these different ways of the objects that are quotidian objects, sure, they could be used differently. But what I'm trying to get at is like, how are Jews using them as part of constructing this Jewish identity? So I spend a fair amount of time thinking about like, how is the way we've defined Judaica actually very synagogue-centered and very male-centered in terms of objects that only men would touch? And how has that limited our discussion in terms of what it means to have Jewish objects?
Very, very, yeah, those details are very telling. And I think to a great extent, we limit our vision because, especially as trained academics, we're kind of drawn to words, text, and objects that are clearly kind of marked. And really, Laura came to my graduate seminar when you were at Bard. I guess that was like 2 years ago, and you did a whole thing on fashion. And again, there was nothing particularly Jewish, but you were able to show how the way these Jews used it, used this particular collar, did something different, and so it turns it into a Jewish object in that way.
And again, Ronnie, I think if we think of our own lives,
Yeah.
many of us can identify with that, right? Like we do our Jewishness through our clothing in a variety of, not always, like, but certainly some of the time, right? So like, again, I think if we pause, we have this moment of like, oh, people in the past, like today.
I mean, there's so many ways, a minivan, it means something very different, in very different contexts. It seems to be the most neutral kind of item, but obviously in the way it's used, where I live, it's a clear marker, especially if it has certain stickers on it, exactly, there's a whole package that goes along with it. And in other communities where you have more kids, I think, a bigger van, those little mini buses. But anyways,
even my 12-year-old knows that minivans are part of like Orthodox Jewish identity, and is very concerned that, like, what does it mean that we don't have a minivan? We have a Prius because we have fewer children. So I think, like, again, very instinctive that we get these messages of like what would be a Jewish car? Does that mean only Jews have those cars? Absolutely not, right? But
yeah, right, forces you to kind of read a little bit against the grain and look at the absences, right? I think that's something that all three of you confronted, was the need to look interstitially, kind of in between the things that are more obvious. I mean, even at the same time that, like Hilit, you mentioned that Chumash, that's a canonical work of clearly, Jewish, that's clearly squarely in the Jewish realm, for all the reasons. And yet there's so much else that you need to kind of think a little bit creatively and think about those gaps and the absences, and what are the absences saying also, and what's that doing. I have many more questions, but I think for today, I'm going to ask one other question, which something that is really exciting, especially when a project's done and it's coming out into the world, to be able to reflect on it. My question for you guys is, what changed on your journey with this book? You started out with, you thought it was a particular project. What things surprised you? Did you have a major shift? This is more about methodology, and I think about the alchemy of research. And I'll leave it open, but like, to what extent did your assumptions change, or did the projects change based on the reality? In all three cases, again, what what you end up finding determines your project. So you guys can talk to that. Was that clear? Yeah, and it's pretty open, so.
I guess.
Yeah, why not? Why not? We'll keep it in that circulation.
So I think that, over the course of this project, it's changed many times. And, if somebody were to find every chapter or, conference paper ever written as part of this project, it would be, a 600 chapter book. So I would say on the first, yes, I let my sources guide me. I let the material available guide me. What I had access to, what was available. Obviously, the quality of many of the textual sources in the Caribbean are challenging, because of climate, fires, earthquakes, whatever, hurricanes. But I'll say that there was a strong shift to material culture over the last few years. And I don't only think that, I think that started happening about 4 or 5 years ago. As in my mind, every time I sat down to write, in my mind, it was connected to kind of a certain object that I had seen. And obviously in conversation with Laura over the years, I began to better understand, and another colleague of mine, Shrina Gandhi, who does this in a different context, I began to better understand the significance of these objects in the narrative that I was seeking to tell. And the other aspect that I think shifted significantly is because I'm in a religion department, because I'm primarily not only an Americanist, but a Caribbeanist, that my work or the narrative or, what it is that the way that I'm thinking about things has been greatly impacted by many of the kind of post-colonial and other theorists also, but of Caribbean studies, and kind of the way that we imagine the Caribbean, the way that Caribbean religions is situated within the broader field of scholarship. And I would say that was the kind of the theoretical turn and kind of the post-colonial turn, I would say was not only impacted by, professors that I've had in the past, but I think, by my own teaching within the field of Caribbean studies over the last few years, and kind of the amazing work which has come out in that field. So I would say those are the two things.
I can't even begin to describe how much this project has changed over time, but it's changed also me and who I am over time, not only as a person and as a researcher, but to give you a sense, when I first started working on this a long time ago, I thought I was going to write a dissertation about Yosef Chaim David Azulai's Magal Tov, Hebrew travel literature. So I obviously didn't write that. That's what I thought I was going to do. And then this was kind of a side curiosity, really, that was suggested to me by my advisor. So I'm like, okay, why not look at it? And then over time, it took on these different forms. So first of all, it's like, okay, forget about Azulai. I'm going to write about this. And then when I was working on the dissertation, it was, okay, this is going to be about, at first I wanted to do a project about emotionality, about emotions. And then Eli Faber, the great Americanist, said, don't do that. So I did it. And then, so then it ended up becoming a project about family life. And I was particularly interested about how rejudaization happens on a familial level and that kind of thing. And then over time, it evolved into a whole communal history and a history about a diaspora, about a community wherein family life was intertwined. But like, what was my dissertation is like 3 chapters of this book, but the book is vastly expanded. So it really took on multiple different forms over the years. And I think as a lesson, if we're going to draw a lesson from that as researchers, it's exactly what Hilit said, is you just stay true to your sources and let the sources guide you. And that's what I think all of our projects have in common. And that's what I hope on its best day, that's what this book is. that it's a book that was true to its sources, I decided, okay, I'm going to write about wills, and I'm going to let the wills speak for themselves with as little intervention as possible, only to make them coherent. So if the best compliment anyone can give to this book is, and this is not a suggestion to the potential reviewers out there, but it's to say that, is that the book stays true to the voice of the wills, that it's just, that my role as an author was just to kind of give them a coherency. So that to me, and so my identity changed. I had started off as being, I'm gonna like really almost a cultural historian, maybe even literary historian, and then I've turned into a social historian, and I like what I've become. So that's my story of evolution.
I would say, in some ways, the thing that was most unexpected for me about this project was the shift towards emphasizing about how objects get collected. So kind of the afterlife of the objects, that I spent a fair amount of time looking at both how objects passed through families, but also the people who collected them and put them in museums or archives. So J.J. Lyons, who was the clergyman for Surowitz-Israel in the 19th century and was a big collector, ends up being a kind of minor figure in my book because he was so important for like gathering Jewish documents and deciding which ones are important and which ones aren't. So that kind of way in which preservation of things and those decisions along the way, that ended up being a much bigger part of the story than certainly in my earlier projects than it had ever been, that I was more interested in how people continue to use the objects to tell stories about Jews in early America over time and how those stories changed. So.
Sorry, the afterlife of objects. That sounds like a great conference topic. Wow. Well, I want to thank all of you for this really, like I said at the beginning, this is a real deep dive into an express deep dive into some really fascinating history and very provocative. I think all these three new works are going to touch on a lot of certainly my work and the work of many people in the field, and it's really exciting to see how it's going to keep on creating a situation of I'm blanking on the word, but on synergy. I'm sorry, synergy. That's what I was looking for. And like we said at the beginning, I look forward to having more of these and more of these in person eventually. I want to thank the American Sephardi Federation, and they have a great lineup, and I'm going to let Drora talk about that. Drora, you want to?
I don't need to talk about it. I talked about it at the beginning. You can see here, but you do notice the congregations hopefully at our synagogue tour on
that's going to be very fun.
I'm very excited about that. And the Zahot is just a once in a lifetime event. And think outside of the Western Sephardi experience, and we have many more programs.
Yes, excellent lineup of great things to deepen and broaden your horizons. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to being in touch soon.
Yeah, thank you all for participating and for speaking. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you again soon in person.
Okay.